Hello and welcome to this latest webcast from St James Church, Yeovil. I'm David Keane. I'm the vicar of St James and St Peter's in Yeovil, and it's the 31st of March. It's a Tuesday, and we are into, I don't know how many days, weeks of lockdown has it been. I thought it might be useful to think a bit about solitude in the Christian tradition. We've all been forced into this situation where we now have limited contact with people. Some of us won't see anybody face to face for days, 2 days, for longer, maybe even just over social media or something like that. So how do we cope with this enforced solitude? How do we cope with being deprived of the company of other people, whether that's work or family or social groups or whatever? The Christian tradition actually has an enormous amount to say about solitude and how it can be used well. That starts with Jesus himself. Jesus has 40 days in the desert on his own at the start of his ministry, and Luke's gospel tells of how Jesus returned in the power of the Holy Spirit, that there's something about that experience of solitude, of intensive prayer and focus on God, that somehow sharpens Jesus up and makes him a much more powerful individual and much more in tune with the power and grace of God when he comes out of that experience. Jesus is constantly going back to a place of solitude all the way through his ministry. Luke again says that Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. After a busy time in ministry in one town, his disciples are trying to find him the following morning because everyone wants to meet Jesus, and he's gone off up the hillside to pray. After the feeding of the 5,000, he sends the disciples away in a boat and stays again on the hillside on his own, praying. Just before his trial and crucifixion, where does Jesus go? He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane, and he says to his disciples, wait over here whilst I go and pray. And he goes to seek God on his own. And so again and again in the life and ministry of Jesus, when he's about to choose the 12 disciples, he spends a whole night on a hillside in prayer alone. Jesus is constantly seeking the solitary place so that his engagement with people can be as effective as possible. There's that rhythm of engagement and withdrawal all the way through the ministry of Jesus. And it's a pattern that the early church picks up. Peter has a really significant vision whilst he's sat on the roof of a friend's house. He's gone up there, that's his hillside. He's gone up there to pray and to be with God. God speaks to him, and through that, a whole new people group start to hear the good news about Jesus. So again, that rhythm of solitude and engagement, of withdrawing to be with God and then engaging with people in greater power and grace and effectiveness. If you roll forward into the early church, as Christianity emerged from the underground and started to become an acceptable way of living life, an acceptable set of values, an acceptable faith to hold, increasingly people would start to flee from the cities and the towns where people were gathered and head off into the desert for a more authentic experience of God. Many of the early monks, like people like St Anthony, would disappear into the desert around the Middle East to try and be alone with God and to get away from the crowds. Why? Well, for example, there's a statistic published a few years ago that found that people in London, on average, walked about half a mile an hour faster than people anywhere else in the country. Why was that? Well, London's quite a busy place, quite a bustling place, but then everybody living there had got into the rhythm of the place, that London itself had moulded and shaped and discipled its inhabitants to walk at a certain speed. And there is something about being with people that shapes us, moulds us, disciples us to live at a certain speed, to speak at a certain speed, to listen at a certain speed, to be following the 24-hour news media or all the things that are going on Facebook or whatever it is, that there's something about the crowd that sweeps us along. So there was something about those early monks that said, no, we're aware that we're being steadily drawn away from God by this. We want to go and find God afresh by going on our own into the wilderness, into the desert to find him. The trouble is, what they discovered was that it was really hard to do that on their own. So they started to cluster together in groups, and the early monasteries were groups of people that had their own individual cave or building where they could pray and seek God on their own. But they also had a bit of community life as well. And that's the thing about solitude, that to do solitude well, you need community. But to do community well, you need solitude. We've all been in those groups. Maybe you haven't, in which case good for you. Been in those groups where it's just been one person broadcasting and everybody else listening. And there hasn't been a conversation, it hasn't been a social time, it's just been an audience for the person with the loudest voice and the person who didn't stop for breath. Well, that's not really great community. So we need solitude to teach us all sorts of things that help us to do community well. Solitude teaches us the value of silence. It teaches us how to hold our tongue, how to stop, how to sift our thoughts before just broadcasting them everywhere. Solitude teaches us how to become more comfortable with who we are. It can be really uncomfortable to start with. The language of the early monks going into the desert talked about wrestling with their demons. And when we are just alone with our thoughts, our motivations and who we are, that can be quite frightening. That can be quite intimidating. Stories told of a psychiatrist in a young offenders institute who would get some of the people coming to us, some of the young lads coming to her after the first few days, complaining about hearing voices in their heads, until she realised that because they'd had to leave most of their possessions outside the young offenders institute and didn't have music and sound and noise going on all the time, that this was the first time they'd been able to hear their own thoughts. What's it like just to sit with our own thoughts? No music, no telly, no internet, no distractions, just you and your thoughts and yourself. What solitude does is it teaches us about ourselves, it teaches us more about who we are, it helps us to be honest about who we are and honest before God. And that makes us better people when we re-engage. Two men were trying to get a job at a lumberjacks, and so they were put to work for a day to see how well they do at chopping trees down. One of them got his saw out and was sawing away all day. The other one would saw away for 45-50 minutes and would stop, sit down and sharpen his saw. And whilst he did so, he'd rest. And the one that sharpened the saw got a lot more trees down during the day than the one that just worked feverishly all the time. Solitude can be a place where we sharpen the saw, where we stop work, where we intentionally do something else, where we intentionally disconnect from what we're doing in order to do something better, in order to do something that makes us more effective. So what does solitude teach us? Well, it teaches us control over the tongue. It teaches us what our own thoughts are really like when we're rid of distractions. It gives us space to pray and to be with God. John Wesley's mother, Susanna Wesley, she had 10 children. And every day in our house, she would put her apron up over her head, and the household would know that Susanna Wesley didn't want to be disturbed. This is what is said about her. Every person in the household, from the smallest toddler to the oldest domestic helper, knew well to respect this signal. When Susanna was under the apron, she was with God, and not to be disturbed, except in the case of the direst emergency. There, in the privacy of her little tent, she prayed for her husband and children, and plumbed the deep mysteries of God in the scriptures. So if a mother of 10 can do it, then maybe the rest of us can do it as well. So when we've got enforced solitude, how do we go about making the most of it? Time to reflect, time to pray, time to study, time to read scripture, time to wrestle with our thoughts and to work them out. How do we go about that? When it's enforced, the time can just all blur into one, can't it? We don't have any structure or rhythm to our day. There aren't the meetings, there aren't the work, there aren't the things that we would normally do that give us those reference points through the week. So we'll need to create our own reference points, our own time slots through the day. The early monks would do that by having set times for morning prayer, afternoon, evening and night prayer. And so you might want to use the podcasts that we're putting out. See details on our St James or St Peter's website. Or you might want to join in other things like the Fitness Man, who's on at 9 o'clock every morning. I did that last week and was stiff as a board for 3 days, so I don't recommend it for people my age. But having fixed points in the day where we can come aside to be with God, maybe using a journal or a diary to write out our thoughts and get them in order, to have some kind of plan for what we're going to read or what we're going to pray about, or even to read some of the people that have practiced solitude themselves. Julian of Norwich, who basically went into self-isolation in order to pray. You can probably find some of her material online. Joyce Huggett has done some great books on listening to God and listening to others. Richard Foster, great writer on the spiritual life. His book Celebration of Discipline has a chapter on solitude. You can order those from places like Eden Books, Christian bookseller, or from Amazon. But have some time through the week, maybe one day a week or a bit of time each day, to read about other people who've practiced solitude and practiced it well and how they've made it work for them. Reading the spiritual classics. Maybe have a physical focus as well, a piece of art or a candle or a bit of Play-Doh that you can fiddle about with, or if you're a very tactile person, having something to touch and hold on to. That's why prayer beads are very popular within the Catholic tradition. So it might be helpful for you to have something to hold, or something to play about with whilst you're praying and whilst you're in your time of solitude. And think about how to make it work, how to make solitude fruitful. When Jesus went to pray, sometimes he went to pray just to refresh and reconnect with God. Sometimes it was for a particular purpose, so to get strength for facing the cross or to choose the disciples. I was reading the other day, an American writer called Bill Hybels, a church leader, who talked about he was on a journey that was going to last 2 or 3 hours, and ahead of him was 6 really busy weeks leading up to Christmas. And he spent the journey writing out all the things that he had to do and picking out 6 things that he was going to focus on in the following 6 weeks. And he said because he'd made that decision, because he'd had that focus, that 6x6 plan, that he was able to have a much more fruitful 6 weeks than if he just blindly stumbled into it and reacted to things that had happened to him day by day. So that might be a way to think about how to use your solitude over the weeks ahead. Think about over the next 6 weeks, what would I like to achieve? Whether you want to complete a jigsaw, dig over the garden, practice an instrument every day, read through a book that's always been on your shelves but you've never quite got round to, read through one of the Gospels if you've never read it before. But have something that at the end of the 6 weeks you'll know you've achieved something. You'll know that you've got somewhere. Use your time of solitude. Use your apron over the head time to think with God and to work out with God, okay, if I've got this time, if I don't have much choice over it, how can I use it really well? How can I make it pay? How can I make it work for me? Because, yes, this is an ordeal. For some of us, it is really, really hard, but it might also be a gift. It might be a gift. The fever of life is hushed and the busy world is shut down for a moment. What do we find? What can we find now that we're not able to find the rest of the time? I'm told by 1 or 2 folk in my household that I might, for the first time in probably about 5 or 6 years, actually get around to tidying my study. And you can tell by the state of what's around me that it certainly needs it. So if you're watching another of these podcasts in a month or two's time, let me know if you can spot the difference between what's behind me now and what's up there then. So there are things that this time of solitude might be able to give us. It's a gift of time. It's a gift of being less hurried. It's a gift of being able to sit back and choose, okay, I'm going to focus on this. I'm going to learn that. I'm going to read that. I'm going to pray through this particular issue. It might be that we can make solitude really work for us, to sharpen the saw, to deepen our lives with God, to deepen our understanding of who he is, to become stronger in our understanding of who we are as well. I did a gap year in an alcoholics hostel in London, and hearing the stories of the men who'd ended up there as homeless alcoholic men, it was apparent that from very early in their lives they'd used alcohol as a prop. When something had gone wrong, they turned to drink rather than try to deal with it. So at each time when they'd had the chance to build up some emotional and personal strength in response to trouble, instead they hadn't bothered, they just drunk themselves silly. And then the following year I went to university and I met students who were at the start of the same process. Something would go wrong, and instead of dealing with it, instead of finding the resources within themselves or working out how to cope with emotional trouble, they just blotted it all out. And by setting up that pattern for the rest of their lives, it did make me worry where they were going to end up in a few decades' time. What's that got to do with this? Well, solitude, it's a difficult time. This is a difficult time for all of us. And we can try and blot it out with noise or just crouch in a corner until it's all gone away. Or we can say, okay, God, this gives me an opportunity. This is going to be tough, but maybe it can help me to become tougher. Maybe it can help me to become deeper. Maybe it can help me to become more patient, more resilient, more loving, more outward looking, more prayerful, more reflective, less talkative, less whatever. But maybe a time of solitude is a gift to us to help us to grow. Nature has these times every year. Every year, most of the plants in our garden retreat into themselves, retreat into the ground, disappear from view. But what happens during that disappearing from view is then what results in what's going to happen around us in the next few weeks. Spring, new life, flowering, fruitfulness, branches, leaves, growth. But it's what happens in the darkness. It's what happens underground. It's what happens in the solitude and the silence of creation through the winter and early spring that then results in the growth later. So can I encourage you to spend a bit of time this week just sitting down with God and saying, okay, how can I make this work? What is it that you and I can do together with this time of solitude that will help me come out of it in the power of the Holy Spirit and walking more closely with Jesus? And may God bless you as you do it.